many of those parts of the world are in the middle of an energy crisis as well. So it's a really important topic to talk about how the two are connected, what this energy crisis means for climate action, how climate will affect energy security and geopolitics, and what those intersections are between security, geopolitics, climate, and the clean energy transition that has to accelerate dramatically to achieve goals like 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that is the topic of our discussion today, and I'm really delighted that my friend from The Economist, Vijay Vataswaran, is able to moderate this conversation. He is the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor for The Economist. You don't know necessarily who you're reading in The Economist, but almost certainly if you're reading something really thoughtful and smart on energy and climate, Vijay is the author of it, including a great overview recently of what's happening with clean energy in India. Maybe we can talk about that. But thanks for being with us, Vijay.
Jason, thank you very much. That's an introduction only a mother could love, but I appreciate it, the kind words. It's a tremendous honor to be with you here today and to discuss what I think is really one of the most pressing topics facing the world today, not just the climate world. That is the nexus between geopolitics, energy, and climate as we're here to advance at this COP summit. But I just for a moment wanted to cast our gaze back to a century ago to remind ourselves that geopolitics and energy have been linked in the past. On the eve of the First World War, Winston Churchill, then a very young First Lord of the Admiralty, made a fateful decision. He decided to convert the British naval fleet from burning domestic stores of coal from Wales to a new source of energy, oil, that came at that time from the Persian Gulf, the new fields of the Persian Gulf. This had a powerful impact on the war. It gave British fleets the ability to go further, have faster refueling. It gave a decisive advantage in the naval war with Germany. But it also, of course, had longer-term ripple effects in terms of the geopolitics of the Middle East and of the development of those oil resources and the wars that would be fought indirectly or directly as a result of those kinds of colonial and imperialist approaches. And economic and energy politics became incredibly intertwined. And I mentioned that as backdrop. That's a century ago. Half a century ago, in fact, 2023 will be the 50th anniversary of the energy shock, the first Arab oil embargo, when we saw in a very powerful way how energy and geopolitics were indeed linked. And yet, we went through several decades of, I would argue, complacency, of benign geopolitical headwinds, of perhaps in the golden age of globalization, as it was called, with greater trade, the development of interconnections between markets and supply chains. And these have come very rudely, if not to an end. Certainly they've been jolted in the last couple of years, particularly in Europe, particularly in the heart of Europe, with a war on the old continent, having dramatic implications for the world, reminding everyone that energy is not to be seen through one filter, such as climate. However important it is, we have to think about some of the other pillars as well, such as affordability and economics, and of course, security and geopolitics. With that as the frame, Jason, give us a sense of how you think geopolitics now, the topic of our conversation right now, has made its arrival as perhaps an unwelcome visitor to the climate conference, to the world of climate ambition, which is what came out of Glasgow. What a difference a year makes. And how do you see this playing out? Could this advance the climate agenda, as is argued, and we'll pick up this argument, or do you worry that there may be some sideways move or delay in the progress on climate ambition?
Yeah, I think the starting point should be that, of course, climate change itself is going to be a massive source of geopolitical risk, with drought and heat waves and water scarcity impacting conflict and migration. So we need to move much more urgently to decarbonize than we are. I think the history of energy geopolitics, as you rightly described, for many decades, if you ask someone, what do you mean by energy geopolitics, they would probably talk about the Arab oil embargo, or OPEC, or Nord Stream 2, and Europe's dependence on Russia. And to the extent you have an energy transition, which again, oil and gas use are going up every year, not down, but if you were to have that, you would see those risks wane over time. I think that leads people to sometimes think then we'd be living in a copacetic era where energy geopolitical risk would be minimal. And I don't think that's right either. I think the energy transition itself, if we have one at the scale and speed we need, which we must, will be a major source of geopolitical risk and instability because it's going to move forward in fits and starts. It's going to see potentially more volatility rather than less. There's an end state of net zero, and then there's a multi-decade process of getting from here to there. We're already seeing the potential for, the World Energy Outlook that just came out, warned about making sure that we're not retiring assets before clean energy is ready to pick up the slack, the potential for tight markets that actually enhance the geopolitical power of dominant petrostates like Russia or some in the Gulf before they decline. We're seeing the potential for climate action like the United States Inflation Reduction Act, a historic measure, which to get the political support it needed has elements of protectionism in it, that if you want your tax credits, you have to do a lot of that activity in the United States. We're already seeing a backlash from Europe there. We are seeing the way in which at this COP, rising tensions, divergence, not convergence, between developed and developing countries is on full display, right? The World Energy Outlook just found this is the first year that the number of people who can't afford energy access is going up, not down. 75 million more people, wiping out a decade of progress. And then, of course, you have the new forms of clean energy that will be heavily dependent on critical minerals, 90% of those refined and processed today in China. We need to think about how to define energy security for a process of transition and then hopefully for an end state of a clean energy economy. And the risks will be different, and the tools we will need to mitigate them will need to be different than the ones we have today, which are not fit for purpose. The SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, oil stocks, these are not necessarily the tools that were created a half century ago that we need to deal with the risks of a clean energy economy. And I identify those risks not to say we should slow down the transition. On the contrary, we need to accelerate it. But if we don't anticipate what some of the geopolitical pitfalls will be along the way, I worry that that could slow the transition. If we have geopolitical or price volatility along the way, that's not only going to be bad geopolitically and economically and for national security. From Sri Lanka to iconic Yellow Vest protests, I worry it could undermine climate ambition. It could undermine support for the pace of the transition we need.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but you laid out the landscape pretty well. I'm sure, as we discuss it with our panel, we'll get into the different dimensions of the points you made. But it seems to me there is a tension at the heart of the complicated and nuanced picture you lay out. And that is sometimes, attending COP and other climate gatherings, I feel like I'm coming into the land of the believers, right? You have to believe, otherwise you'd never come to these meetings and never hope that there could be any progress. But when I leave, and see, as you point out, I just came here from ADIPEC, which is the world's biggest oil and gas conference in Abu Dhabi. 140,000 people, believe it or not. Makes COP look small. And there, though there was a lot of talk of decarbonizing the existing fossil fuel industry, we had an African minister from Uganda who made a point to say what hypocrites we see in the rich world, particularly Europe, consuming natural gas, LNG supplies, liquefied natural gas, paying over the odds, depriving developing countries of the opportunity to use that natural gas at the moment to solve their own crisis, and using more coal, of course, in Europe at the moment. Meanwhile, lecturing African countries not to develop their own natural gas resources for development, for poverty alleviation, to deal with the issues you talked about, the people that will be set back on energy poverty and energy access. And that is very much a theme at this Africa COP. So I do wonder, is it possible to reconcile these tensions? That very IEA report, you talked about the World Energy Outlook, of course, it's from the International Energy Agency. They released their seminal annual report just a week or two ago, I think at this point, a couple of weeks ago. And while they made the point that we need to have fossil energy for the transition, make sure the lights don't go out, Granny doesn't freeze, they also made the argument that we will peak in fossil fuel consumption for oil, coal, and gas before 2030. First time they've made that prediction based on what they see as current policies. So just a quick comeback on that specific thing, because it seems to me if you're ensuring the next few years is short term, and 2030 is not that far away in energy industry terms. It is an industry that invests trillions, assets live for 30, 40 years. So if they're saying we're going to peak by 2030, how can we also add and invest in more oil and gas to keep the lights on? Is there a bit of magical thinking there?
I think there's a real tension, and it's a tension that emerges from the fact that there is a growing, not shrinking gap between ambition and reality with climate and today's energy system. And elevated ambition, which is what Glasgow was about and the Paris Agreement was about, driven by the science of why, and Catherine could talk about it better than any of us, why we need targets like net zero 2050 and 1.5 degrees Celsius, and those are so important. But we are in a world today where, last year, according to the International Energy Agency, global investment in oil and gas was around where it should be, if we were on track for net zero by 2050. The problem is investment in clean energy would be 4 times higher than it is today if we were on track for those goals. So relative to the current outlook for oil and gas demand, we're underinvesting in oil and gas, but we're dramatically underinvesting in clean energy at the pace that would be needed to change that outlook for oil and gas. And that's what leads to potential tight markets and higher prices and price volatility and market crunches that cause economic and political problems. Look at my own country, in the United States, where President Biden passed a historic measure, the Inflation Reduction Act, by far the largest action on climate in US history, to dramatically accelerate investment in clean energy, including electric vehicles, and slash oil demand. That doesn't happen overnight. It takes time for the vehicle stock to turn over and to people to buy a new car, and hopefully that's an electric car. And at the same time, worried about what was going to happen a few days ago, in part, threatening a windfall profits tax, promising to buy oil for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve if prices fall below a certain level, to incentivize oil producers in the US to produce more oil. Because the reality of today and what it takes to make sure energy is affordable today, there's a disconnect between where we are today and where we need to be in the next several years to come, 5 years, 10 years, as that transition accelerates. And so what the IEA talked about was how do we think about, what they talked about in the World Energy Outlook was how to make sure that you are not retiring infrastructure, you're maintaining existing assets for some extent and some period in which you need them, but making sure that those can pay for themselves quickly, maybe be short cycle sources of supply, because what we don't want to be doing is making investments today to meet today's energy needs that are inconsistent with where we need to be 10, 20, 30 years from now. And there is a tension there.
That's a good launching off point to turn to Anne. Anne Mettler, you're Vice President for Europe at Breakthrough Energy, which invests in long-term technologies, deep innovations that could have a big impact on the climate future. And you're in the heart of the storm, as it were. You're based in Europe. You deeply feel what's happening there. Can you give us your perspective on this tension we've identified? And in Europe, what I'm reading is very much the lessons from the invasion and how to respond to it is to double down on the energy transition, on clean energy. Can you tell us how that's going to work?
Yes, thank you. Is this loud enough? Okay. So yes, I mean, to the extent that I see a silver lining in this war, it is that it is, at least in Europe, now really accelerating the energy transition. I think that that is fair to say. And here we already spoke about the IEA and the World Energy Outlook. But I listened when Fatih Birol, the executive director, introduced the report, and he said something that really resonated with me, which is, he said that we are seeing a turning point in the history of energy. So this is something really, really big. And he identified three causes for that. And all of them really resonated in Europe. The first one is energy security is actually now, according to the IEA, the main driver behind the energy transition. Why? Because it's very, very easy, as we learned the hard way, to weaponize oil and gas. It is much more difficult to weaponize wind and solar. And this is what's really dawning on us now, that this is actually gives us more security. And that, I think, is not just the case in Europe, but throughout the world, right? This is much more difficult to weaponize these clean sources of energy. The second cause for the acceleration is, of course, climate, which we all, feel. We know the incredible summer we had, the heat waves we had in Europe. So I don't even need to focus on this here. But the third one, and really important, he speaks about industrial policy. Speaks about competitiveness. When I started my job in January 2020, we really thought in Europe that we are the leaders on clean energy. And because the US was nowhere to be seen, I mean, it wasn't really in the game, it wasn't really happening. 2 years later, every geography in the world is in this game. Why? Because they realize that abundant and cheap clean energy is now a major attraction for investment. We spoke in the preparation of this panel that now investment is not going to Mexico in some cases because there isn't enough clean energy. We will see in Europe production, especially in heavy industry, in hard-to-abate sectors, we will see that move from Europe to geographies where there's going to be clean and green, cheap, abundant, renewable capacity. So this is a huge opportunity for Northern Africa. The last thing I would say is cost. It is a fact that solar is cheaper. I was yesterday at a dinner where a representative from Saudi Arabia spoke. Saudi Arabia, and said, solar is much cheaper in Saudi Arabia than the fossil fuels. In Saudi Arabia, it's a game changer. So I don't mean to sound naive, but I'm saying there's something really big going on here that we need to wrap our minds around. And please not lose the opportunity that this terrible war would maybe afford to now really make some progress.
Thank you, Anne. I want to push on one of the theses that you're putting on the table. That is in response to this crisis, which is fundamentally in Europe about gas, Russian gas being cut off, in effect, on the eve of winter. No doubt that the screws will be turned further as the weaponization of energy continues. That turning to clean energy, of course, makes sense. The arguments make sense, but these things are not exactly fungible, right? As you rightly point out, hard-to-abate industries, steel, cement, and the high-temperature industrial heat. Windmills and Teslas ain't going to get you there. You can't substitute that way. You need maybe ultimately hydrogen, clean hydrogen. Absolutely. That can be developed, but it's not at scale. It's you can buy bucketfuls of green hydrogen right at the moment, and as opposed to millions and millions of tons which are needed. So there's a question of time frame to develop these industries. And secondly, and I spent a bunch of time in Europe writing a special report for us, a Technology Quarterly, that looked at this question. Wind and solar, particularly in Europe, places like Germany where you have Dunkelflaute, long periods of time with neither prolonged wind and sustained sun, you have intermittency problems. And you need to have backup power. You need firm power. And Europe's solution for this, grid-scale batteries are not there yet, though they look promising. I know Breakthrough invests in them, but is to turn to natural gas. And so there are more natural gas plants being commissioned. So the question is this really going to lead to a fossil lock-in? However undesiring Europe is of it, is that the cold-hearted truth that's going to be hard to avoid, or is there a good plan to avoid that?
Well, I'm no longer working in public policy, so I won't comment on the plans. I do recognize there is that danger. I mean, right now, actually, to some extent, Europe is doubling down on fossil energy. We're building LNG terminals, all of that. However, the naivete is gone. And with that, we understand there's going to be 3, 4, 5 genuinely difficult years. Yeah, no one is naive about this. But there's only one way forward, I'm sorry to say. I mean, this is around clean technologies. So yes, there is going to be a strategy most likely at the EU level on long-duration energy storage, because it's of course clear that the ambitious renewable targets need also storage solutions. You may have seen that Germany recently decided to keep its nuclear fleet online, right? So, I mean, there is a lot more. It's sort of a moment right now in Europe where ideology meets reality, and it's not always pretty, but I can assure you that broadly speaking, there is a realization that the only way forward is really to the clean, green technologies for reasons that I just alluded to. Ultimately, they give us more security, they will be cheaper, and it will be a competitive advantage for Europe.
Okay. Let's see how that plays out with the rest of our panelists.
I do want to remind you, this is a session about opportunity.
I'm very hopeful about the future. I just don't know whether to be hopeful about natural gas or about wind or energy. I'm very enthusiastic about energy storage, I'll tell you. But, like Godot, I may have to wait for it for a while. Let's turn to Catherine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist at the Nature Conservancy, one of the world's leading environmental organizations. You think a lot about climate impacts, but can you help us make the connection between what you see on the climate impact front and the conversation we're having about the future for energy and geopolitics?
So the single best descriptor that I've heard on climate change comes from the US military. They call climate change a threat multiplier. And that is exactly what it is. Whether we are looking at water shortages, food scarcity, supply chain disruptions, health issues, socioeconomic inequalities, or political instability, all of those are exacerbated by the impacts of a changing climate. And that's why this matters so much, because we can't fix anything else that's wrong with this world if we leave climate change out of the picture. So we know that in a world that grows warmer and warmer, with greater floods and storms, more intense droughts and heat waves, we know that the impetus for conflict will increase. And that many of those states that are already on the edge of their stability could be pushed over by climate change, by that final straw on the camel's back. But on the flip side, we also know that what's causing climate change is a huge source of geopolitical conflict, as you've just discussed. And some of you may have noticed my dress. This is actually a scientific dress because it is showing the warming stripes of global temperature as they have changed over the last 100 years. As I walked into the Blue Zone this morning, I saw a woman wearing a scarf made of the same fabric. I immediately walked over to her and introduced myself, and as she turned around her name tag, I realized I knew her. Her name is Svetlana Kakhovska, and she is a Ukrainian climate scientist who was on a final call for the IPCC report when the bombs started to fall. And what she said has resonated around the world. She said that fossil fuels are at the root of climate change and the root of the war on Ukraine. And that to solve both of them, we have to come together. And she said the way people have come together in Ukraine, setting aside all differences, realizing that they must fight for their better future, is exactly the way the world must come together, putting aside our differences to fight for that better future. So there is both a warning and a hope in that situation that we're all in this together, and we need to fix it.
I'm really glad Carlos is the one going after Catherine.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you mentioned Carlos. Carlos, let's turn to you. First of all, let us see your handkerchief. Are you wearing the appropriate colors for this conference?
It's in my heart.
In your heart. There we go. There we go. Pick up on that really powerful observation made by Catherine. How do you see this complicated geopolitical picture affecting the energy picture, in particular in developing countries? I know you're based in Mexico, a place where I used to be bureau chief for The Economist. My heart is still in Mexico, but it's a crucible of some very complicated energy politics at the moment. And maybe broaden that question out to what you see as the challenges, particularly for developing countries.
Vijay, thanks. And just going back to the, excuse me, the point you made, it is phenomenally powerful, and it's phenomenally powerful, emotional, and deeply real. I was the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine for a number of years, and it's very hard to see places that you've walked across, people who want a peaceful future, having their lives destroyed and their reality turned to rubble. In the developing world, there is another kind of pain. And what's interesting is that many developing countries are saying that, you know, we've been experiencing these problems of energy security for a long time. And we don't have energy security, we don't have energy transition, and we don't have affordability. And it's actually gotten worse, because now there's a commodity shock where the price of fuels is higher, price of food is higher, metals and minerals. There's a pressure that they're facing where not only they are facing difficulties developing their hydrocarbon resources, but companies that previously invested are having difficulty doing that. And the example that you gave in Uganda, I mean, it's quite sharp, where you had the European Parliament condemning the development of the East Africa gas pipeline or oil pipeline. And yet at the same time, you've had European heads of states going to Africa seeking to buy more fuel. And you can't buy that fuel unless you invest in it and can produce it over a longer period of time. They're saying that their debt is becoming more complicated because of currency devaluations, and now they have, in local currency terms, less resources to invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. And they're also saying that with rising interest rates, the cost of capital is higher. So what was a cheap renewable energy project in Europe or the United States is simply not competitive and not commercial. And so what they're saying, and here it's put in the context of this conference, we've all heard about it, in the context of loss and damage. And the reality is that it's bigger than that, because we're talking about something which is a fundamental retreatment of their debt, a re-examination of their fiscal potential, the ways in which they can have access to capital, the partnerships that they can obtain in order to be able to bring technology and capability into the developing world and into Africa. And there are lots of examples at this COP of individual pieces that are being worked on. We should talk about methane, for example, if we can, because Egypt has been right in the center of it. But the reality is that these issues have to be addressed, and they're not just geopolitics. The word we're not saying is national politics, right? If you can't create jobs, if people don't have a sense of a better livelihood, then politicians are not going to be in office, and it's going to be difficult to sustain consistency in their policies. And so the point that we're raising here is not to say that it's not important to address climate change. It's that there are political realities behind it, and if we don't address those political realities and the economic realities at the same time, then we're not going to come up with solutions which are going to be viable.
You mentioned methane, which is an important topic at this event and more broadly as such a potent greenhouse gas. I want to come to that in just a little bit, but I want to pick up on your observation about the barriers to investment in, particularly in emerging markets, right? Anne rightly scolded me for not picking up on the topic of our session, which is opportunity, the final word in our session. I was only waiting to set up the opportunity narrative. Don't worry. I've written about innovation my whole life, Anne, so I'm with you. I believe in a brighter future, but you have to set up the context first. So let me, since you've talked about the challenge, from your perspective, you're both public sector perspective, but also now in the private sector. You have a chance to talk to lots of investors. You understand the barriers to investment in the enormous opportunity in the global south for example, solar. The greatest solar potential is in countries that have the most sun, and yet most of the capital goes to countries that have less sun. Northern Europe, Germany is an example, right, historically. Foreign exchange risk, domestic political, perceptions of domestic political risk. There are numerous reasons why we're not getting the 6x to 10x increase in flows of capital that we need to developing countries to achieve the more ambitious net zero goals, even though a lot of the potential is there. Do you see any pragmatic suggestions coming out of this COP or more generally that could help reduce those barriers so that private capital flows particularly can get to those projects that we need?
Let me give a couple of examples. Yesterday I had a very interesting conversation here with, I'll just say, a renewable energy company. I don't know if they would want their name said. And they're very active in renewable energy development in Africa. What did they tell me? If we want to develop renewable energy power plants in Africa, we have to find large industrial off-takers, for example, oil and gas companies that are going to use it in order to power their fields. And maybe from that, they can power the communities around it, because you know what? They will have, it's an off-taker that will pay me. If I go to a utility in countries X, Y, or Z, I will never get paid because they can't collect. And so unless we have a mechanism that deals with that issue of risk and repayment.
Counterparty risk, as it were.
Counterparty risk that is going to affect the cost of capital. One project may carry an interest rate that might be 3%, and the other one might carry an interest rate of 20%. Same technology,
right,
but fundamentally different issue, right? And I'll just say one thing about Egypt, if I could, on methane, because I think it's really interesting what they're doing. They recognize that on the global methane pledge, that if in fact industry is the principal cause of the production of methane, if you don't involve industry in actually fixing the problem, you aren't going to actually have projects that will address it. And so they're now working on a roadmap that brings together a public-private partnership on bringing industry into the process, using the best technologies that are available from satellites. Satellite companies that are saying, you know, here I am, I'm ready to provide data, creating rapid reaction activities that are based on engagement with local operators, targeting those entities, having quick responses. And you know what a critical factor is? The price of gas is high, and as a result of that, capturing that methane has a commercial value. So not only does it get the methane out of the atmosphere, it addresses additions to the natural gas market that will be compensating the European market for the loss of Russian gas. And those are the kinds of practical commercial activities that may seem small, but can have a big impact.
That's a great point. There are not a lot of real win-wins in the energy world. They're usually trade-offs. But getting that fugitive methane to market and monetizing it at current high prices, boy, that's a big win. And I think the IEA has done some analysis, even before the highest prices we've seen on for natural gas, that some 70% or more of the fugitive methane escaping, for example, from America's Permian Basin, where a lot of oil and gas is produced, will pay for itself, basically, for the costs that are involved, and probably even more these days.
Except that there's no infrastructure to export more natural gas. We're using all of it, so you have to build new infrastructure that takes a 20 or 30-year contract to make it financeable and pay for itself.
It's actually not true. We did a study of this together with the Environmental Defense Fund, and from that, we identified about 45 billion cubic meters worth of existing natural gas export capacity, not in the United States, but in developing countries, that is available now, that if you help capture that methane in developing countries like Egypt and Nigeria, that it will actually be additional gas that's put onto the market.
That's really powerful. A lot of gas is vented, it's flared. The old joke in the oil industry used to be, if you find gas once, you're forgiven. Find it twice, you're fired. Because you need infrastructure to get gas to marketplace. You need pipelines, you need perhaps local power stations, other facilities. And so the industry's developed, but especially in less developed countries, there isn't that infrastructure, and that it's vented or wasted. Yes, Catherine, jump in.
And for those of you not as familiar with methane and CO2, let me just explain why capturing it and burning it is a climate win. It's because methane is much more powerful at trapping heat than CO2, over 30 times more powerful. And natural gas is mostly methane. So if the natural gas is leaking and escaping into the atmosphere, it's many times stronger than if you burn it, because when you burn it, you convert it into CO2. And CO2 is still a heat-trapping gas, but a lot less than you had in the first place.
Thank you. It's less long-lived than CO2, it's fair to say, but if we look at the next 20 years, this is a huge elephant in the room that we did not fully appreciate until most recent years, until some of the satellite data, ground observations, drones, light airplanes that are now, and ground observations that are now making it apparent how much more methane we're leaking than we understood previously. So we do see the global methane pledge. We see oil and gas companies coming together in coalitions to work on this. So there is progress, and it is something where because it's monetizable, we can see the business model reason to do it. You don't have to count on charity or benevolence from the industry to do this. I still want to come back, though, to the question of opportunity. And I want to come to you, Anne, in a moment, but I want to give Jason a moment to talk about one of the ideas that has been put forward by your colleagues at Columbia on reducing the risk to getting private sector capital into emerging markets. Carlos talked a little bit about some of the barriers to getting that flow. Some of your colleagues have talked about a mechanism for dealing with foreign exchange risk, which is one of the factors that's off-putting to investors. Can you tell us a little bit about how that might work, and any other instruments, insurance instruments, or other things that you think are promising?
Yeah, that's a whole separate conversation, and we actually had it here in this little venue 2 days ago, because we announced at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy a new large philanthropic gift to create what we've termed the Energy Opportunity Lab. We have some folks here, Diana Hernandez and Andrew Kamau, helping us with that, and trying to think about how to address climate, but also the energy needs and how big those are, not just energy access, but energy for real economic growth and prosperity in the emerging and developing economies. Many aspects to it, I won't describe them all here, but one important one is how to identify risk mitigation, how to think about what the barriers are to putting more capital to work for clean energy projects in emerging and developing economies. One of those, there are many, but one of those is currency exchange risk. We're seeing that today with a very strong dollar, for example. And so a few of my colleagues, John Elkind and Leonardo Beltran and Philip Benoit, have worked with the World Bank and the World Economic Forum on a currency exchange rate coverage facility, which would take blended finance in the value of carbon credits, in multilateral development finance from DFIs, and potentially philanthropic capital or sovereign capital, and try to create a mechanism to mitigate that risk and sort of just offload some of that risk to encourage more investment in the developing world. So that's something that's new that we've developed just recently in the last couple of months, and we're having a number of conversations with people to try to see if we can get that implemented.
I think this is an area where we need a lot more innovation, trial by error if necessary, because if we're going to unlock the trillions in capital that are going to be needed, it's not going to come from government pockets only. There's just not enough money nor political will for that. And so we need private, and there's no shortage of private capital in the world, as we all know. We just needed to have the motivation to go to these places to expect a reasonable return if we're going to see those kinds of trillions. I just want to make one point, Carlos. You talked about local counterparty risk in emerging markets. In India, where I've just spent some time writing an article, which Jason mentioned for The Economist on the clean energy sector, the local utilities, they're so-called DISCOMs, distribution utilities, in many states are bankrupt or very unreliable counterparties that had been a previous barrier to expansion of the sector. It's a state's authority in India that due to their federal structure to run those utilities and support them. But the federal government under Modi has found an innovative solution where the Reserve Bank of India, the federal government, acts as a de facto backstop, allowing them to break through this logjam so that if you're a developer, if you want to get financing, you can have basically the assurance that the federal government stands behind a contract signed by even a relatively rickety local distribution utility. And that's the kind of thinking out of the box that we're going to need in developing countries, as well as some of the development institutions like the World Bank and others that are perhaps too beholden to their AAA rating and therefore aren't taking enough risks. We saw this argument made by Mia Mottley, Prime Minister, who spoke on opening day. We also see this, of course, from numerous other actors saying we need to have a reform of the way that development banks maybe take more risks. Now, Anne, I promised to come to...
Just to say quickly why that's so important, because you quickly use the word trillion, but it's an important word to remind ourselves about, where you're talking about whether the commitment of 100 billion a year can be met. I mean, these are rounding errors compared to the numbers we need. The Nick Stern Vera Sangwe report released here at COP this week put numbers around that, $1 to $2 trillion a year of investment in clean energy every year for the next 30 years. In emerging and developing economies. Most of that is private, not public. And you need that public capital to then catalyze the private capital that is not there. We had about 150 billion in the emerging markets last year. We need to go to 10 times or more.
Absolutely. That's a really excellent report. I recommend it to those of you who haven't seen it yet. And I wanted to come to you on the theme of opportunity and investment. Europe, through particularly the actions of the European Commission, but individual countries as well, like Germany, has doubled down on ambition. Among other things, green hydrogen is seen as an area where Europe can lead. However, is it possible that the United States, with its new legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, really a triple whammy between the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS plus Science Act, and of course this bill, the famous IRA as it's called, is going to put in the biggest investment the U.S. has ever made in this area. But more than that, the level of subsidy and giveaways and support, $3 a kilogram for green hydrogen subsidy is the specific amount of guaranteed subsidy for new projects in the U.S. In the best locations in the U.S., whether in the Southwest with its sun or in Texas where it's windswept, experts are predicting they'll actually have negative cost to make hydrogen in those places. And generally speaking, green hydrogen will become incredibly competitive in the U.S. That's attracting project developers that I've spoken with in India, Europe, and Canada to think about shifting their projects there. What does this do for Europe's ambitions? Is Europe going to up its game? Is it going to cut through the green tape, as I call it, the thicket of regulations and rules and promulgations from Brussels that tie up developers in knots to catch up with the U.S.?
Well, I'm not here to speak officially for Europe, but I will say that there are elements that Europe perceives, I think, perhaps justly as a protectionist. However, what I have been saying to the Europeans is we have wanted the United States in this game for so long. Now that they're finally here, let's embrace it, right? Because what we want at the end of the day is a race to the top. This is a very healthy competition. And I think the real power of the IRA, if I can say so, is not only the amount of money that has been put on the table, because we have that in Europe too. However, it is in many ways the simplicity. What you just mentioned, $3 per kilogram, very easy and very non-discriminatory, right? Any company that fulfills the criteria has access to it, right? Any company. So that means it's actually going to drive a lot of investment into the US. So if I can say that, and I hope not too many European officials are listening, I think it's actually very clever, if I can say that. So, you know, we need to think maybe a little less. I actually like what you say, green tape, taxonomy, and, you know, delegated act on additionality and all of these things, you know, and really think more, how do we drive investment? How do we de-risk? How do we incentivize? And one thing's for sure, and I can say that from having worked in public policy for more than 20 years now, just setting a target or just having some ambition for the future does not necessarily mean you're going to get there, you know, which we had to learn the hard way. So it's very much about implementation, operationalization, incremental change, incentives, driving demand, de-risking, as I just said. So this, I think, was actually very cleverly done in the IRA, if I can say that, or maybe I can't say it.
Well, it's out there now. I'm going to come to the audience in just a minute for your questions, so please collect your thoughts. Let's make some good questions for our gurus, put them on the hot seat. Let me ask first Carlos for a quick response, and Jason, I know you want to jump in on this too, on hydrogen and maybe relatedly carbon capture. From the perspective of opportunity, how big an opportunity is this? Hydrogen has gone through multiple hype cycles, obviously, since Jules Verne first wrote about hydrogen in The Mysterious Island. Some of you might remember 160 years ago. So how seriously should we take the current investment cycle, and how do you give us a reality check on it?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to think about what the world is trying to solve with this issue, right? And eventually there is a need and desire to transition out of natural gas. In the short term, there's a real issue about whether natural gas is a good thing or not. Now, if I can just deviate for a second on this, I think it's important to recognize that the center of the crisis in Europe today is the lack of access to natural gas. It is fundamental to the human crisis and the energy justice crisis that Europe is going through. And so one of the questions that one has to think about is, what are the short-term impacts if you take away part of your tool chest at a given point in time? And should we be raising a different question of not looking at individual fuels, but asking what is the carbon intensity of an ecosystem? And as a result of that, making choices about that. I think it's an important question to debate. But when we come back to the question of natural gas, if you think about it, it's high temperatures for industry. It's in the power system, both providing and addressing issues of intermittency, but also potential use of as a battery. It's in the residential sector for heating in particular in Europe. And if you ask yourself what can substitute for that, if you're looking for a non-carbon alternative, you're back to either nuclear energy or hydrogen, right? And so there's a huge bet here. And as a result of that, the stakes for industry, the stakes for ordinary consumers are absolutely enormous. And so I think that the drive to continue to try to make hydrogen work is fundamental. On carbon capture, I will just say this. It's been a controversial issue. There are some who have argued that carbon capture is a way to extend the lifeline of the hydrocarbons industry, and it should not be allowed. If we think about it, every single roadmap to net zero is based on everything going right. It has to go right. Think about the IEA and the way they constructed their net zero roadmap. They started at the end point and mathematically worked backwards to get to a solution. What it tells us is, and what this war in Ukraine has done, is it showed us that there can be shocks. This is a geopolitical shock. There will be technology shocks. There will be commercial shocks. There will be supply chain shocks. And we need to figure out what are the plan Bs and the plan Cs that allow building resilience so that whenever there isn't a shock, it doesn't become an issue of deviating from the climate goals. It becomes a question of having the resilience to adapt. And if we don't take carbon capture seriously, we are not going to have a plan B for the necessary use of hydrocarbons, which we're still going to find for a period of time.
Well stated, and the emphasis on resilience, I think, is particularly useful because we are certainly in for a rocky transition. Whatever your ideological faith is or bet on technologies, I think we can all reasonably agree that the next 10 years are going to be a bumpy period for the global economy. There's a question in the front row. Jason, will you hold off on your comment until we come back to the panel? Okay, great. So hold on for a moment. Let's hear briefly from our panelists, because I want to make sure to get a couple of questions from the floor. Go ahead.
Yes, very briefly. We mentioned earlier how it's better to burn natural gas than to let it escape. The same is true for hydrogen. It turns out if you burn hydrogen, you're good. But if you don't burn it and it escapes to the atmosphere through leaks in the system, we still have a problem because it has heat trapping potential.
And there's recent peer-reviewed studies on this topic that point this out. It's really important. You're absolutely right. I would make two quick technical observations. Maybe it's the MIT engineer in me. First, hydrogen, for those that don't follow it closely, is not an energy source. You have to make it from something, and so there are ways to make it that are so-called green, meaning from renewable sources. You could make it from nuclear if you want to spend a lot of money. Of course, the alternative that is being promoted by the oil and gas industry, sometimes called blue hydrogen, you make it from, let's say, natural gas. You capture the CO2 emitted through CCS. Those are some rival alternatives in different parts of the world. And we do know how to use hydrogen. The world uses lots of hydrogen in the fertilizer industry and petrochemicals, and it's piped safely, it's managed safely by the chemicals industry and the petrochemicals industry. So, but the question is, if we were to have much wider and dispersed use, would we make sure to have those, the handling of it done properly? And as you rightly say, it would be a terrible thing if we did not do that. So it's a call for vigilance as opposed to a barrier to growth, I would say. Yes,
I
Anne?
just wanted to make a quick comment on this, on when Europe realized its dependence on gas. It was a real reality check, because for all of us, you know, we're so good and we're climate friendly and we're this and that, we didn't realize how much of the energy mix was actually dependent on gas and how devastating it would be. It was sort of a moment where ideology meets reality, and it was really painful. So one of the things, in addition to resilience, is we need to have our eyes wide open and have realism and pragmatism. There are going to be shocks. It's not going to be a linear process. And we need more people who have really, frankly, the guts to say that and to realize it. And we just really had a wake-up call about this in Europe.
Should I go to the front row, Jason? Okay, great. Sir, thank you for your patience, sir. Just identify yourself and your affiliation and make it a good question rather than a long-winded speech.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Tumal Orto. I'm from Kenya. I'm not from the energy industry. I'm a livestock keeper, so it's opposite. Here, we are talking of turning global energy. Here, there's an opportunity. So, being from energy industry or being an expert in Africa or in Kenya or the village where I come from, there is wind power, Turkana wind power stations, a very big one, a project which has taken off. Also in my village, there's also Bubisa wind energy. People are talking about it. It is there. Some activities are taken off. So in general, and also the village I come from is also in the heart of the desert where there's a lot of sun. So my point is, what at the backyard of your mind, what are you thinking about energy opportunity in Africa?
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, sir. That's a powerful question. I want to ask my panelists, not only is it the Africa COP, it's also one of the things that's sitting in comfortable Western capitals is forgotten sometimes. What about his village? What about his country, Africa, developing countries more generally? Are the systems that we're talking about suited to purpose? Or should we really be thinking about doubling down or tripling down on investments in decentralized, microgrids, home-based and village-based solutions, micropayments to enable those? Where's the emphasis on that, and what is the potential of that to play a side-by-side role with any kind of investment in grid-connected, big infrastructure and energy? Jason, do you want to lead us off?
I'm going to volunteer others, actually, and by way of doing that, just note that, Carlos, in addition to ambassador to Ukraine, when President Obama's administration created, for the first time ever, an energy bureau inside the U.S. Department of State to do energy diplomacy, he created that bureau, and I know has thought a lot about that question. And then we also have Andrew Kamau here, who helps to lead the Kenyan Energy Ministry and maybe wants to take the microphone for a moment. I could share my thoughts, but I think we have people better placed, actually.
Sure. Can we have Andrew come up? Or just have a microphone to him, please? Thank you, sir, for your thoughts.
I think Carlos alluded to this when he said that you have a problem with utilities and the credit risk of utilities. But you also have now a lot of smaller companies who have come and have started their own microgrids. And they've been very successful in the way they've been doing it. But the other thing that we were also thinking about with Jason some time back is the fact that people can't afford the electricity, but they have a right to it. Is it a social good? And how do you fund that social good? And these are the things that we are thinking about.
Carlos, a follow-up?
I think one of the challenges is that there isn't one solution. There are many things that have to be brought together. The point of raising microgrids, I think, is really important, because having to, it's kind of like, these things, right? I mean, at one point we assumed that the world would only have telephony if there were certain infrastructure requirements, and this taught us that it could be different. Energy's a bit different, but it is possible to have expansion of access to energy through microgrids. But then we get into financing problems and scale, because it might be one thing to do it on a small scale basis, but how do you really expand that? India's done that more than anybody, and in part the kind of finance assurance scheme that you talked about is key. Being able to bring financing to the development of grid scale, larger scale infrastructure for solar and wind is a big deal. So one of the things I was talking about with one company here in a country that has a sovereign wealth fund is, look, I mean, you have the capacity to put some of this capital at risk. So why don't you work with a group like Jason's at Columbia, taking the currency risk suggestions that are put in place, look at the kind of guarantees that can be placed in other aspects. How do you translate the concept of political risk insurance to other mechanisms and use these to be able to reduce the risk and bring down the cost of capital so that you're not paying 20%, but maybe if you're paying 5%, you can start to make that competitive. The other thing I'm going to say, and this is probably controversial, is that if there is the development of oil and gas, African countries are going to be better off to be able to have partnerships from international companies that can bring the technology that they've developed for digitalization and other forms of capturing emissions that will allow them to produce those hydrocarbons in a way that's cleaner. Because in the end, if those hydrocarbons are going to be used, and if there is going to be demand for them in global markets, one of the things that you want to see with them is that their emissions content, their carbon content is going down as well. And that's the point that needs to be debated, because a lot of people don't agree with that point.
We have a quick question from the floor. We're almost out of time, so let's have one last question. Oh, you found someone here? I'm sorry, I didn't see. Oh, welcome, please. Let's have a quick lightning round. Let's 2 questions, and my panel will respond quickly given the time that we have. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ia, and I'm with Nuclear for Climate. And so I guess you can guess the content of my question by that. But essentially, when we talk about the energy crisis, we're talking such large scales of electricity production. Like only in Europe, we're estimating 4,000 terawatt hours to cover just the fossil-based electricity and heating in Europe right now. How are we going to manage that with purely renewable sources when we've already nearly built the full extent of hydropower we can in Europe?
Thank you. Great question. Just a quick question from you, sir. Please identify yourself.
Christian Lelong from Kairos. We're a satellite analytics company. The question is about coal. It doesn't get talked about a lot in the context of the crisis and opportunity, but 1/3 of methane emissions from the fossil fuel industry come from coal, and removing methane from coal mines is actually pretty straightforward. And coal mining companies are now quite profitable, and so they know and they can how to reduce methane emissions from mining, which amount to about the carbon footprint of Japan. So the question is,
Great.
how can we make sure that this doesn't get forgotten as we focus on methane from oil and gas?
Thank you. I'm going to go in turn down the here. I'll turn to Carlos since you've kicked us off on methane. Maybe you could address this question as well as any final comment you want to make. We'll make it a bit of a lightning round since we're running out of time.
I think on methane, one of the things we recognize, Catherine said it very well, you have to get rid of it. And so on the issue of coal, one of the a basic reality is, when does coal get outside of the competitive mix as a fuel? That's an issue that has different calculations in different parts of the world. But I think that the basic point that we're going to see on methane is that if you can capture it, in order to be able to capture it, you have to create the incentive to be able to do something with it and get commercial value of it. And so I think that that's one of the critical things that we're going to have to think about going forward. What are the creative mechanisms to create a commercial value out of capturing methane, with all of the constraints that you mentioned as well, and the importance of doing it quickly?
Actually, why don't we go to Catherine, since you are also an expert in this area. A follow-up on methane, then we want to get a couple of answers on the important question from the lady. Yeah.
So this is a very good example of an important point. How many years do you think it's been since scientists discovered that methane was leaking out of coal mines, causing the Earth to warm? 170. An Irish scientist named John Tyndall in the 1850s was the first person to identify this. And so this makes a really important point. We honestly don't need more science to act. And I'm a scientist. There's always more things to discover. We can put much more precise numbers on how much worse climate change is making a drought, a heat wave, a hurricane, and all the economic damages associated with it. But in order to act, we do not have to wait for more science. And that's why this panel is so important. We just need to do what's necessary as soon as possible. And for that, we need economics, we need technology, we need policy, and we need the connections at the local scale, because each solution looks different. There's no silver bullet for everyone, but there is a lot of silver buckshot.
And turning to you, well put, beautifully put. On Europe, renewables scaling, what do you say?
Well, I want to go back sort of to the beginning of the session, which is about crisis and opportunity. And if we go back to the last energy crisis, we gave birth essentially to the wind and solar industry, what is today known. It took 4 decades to stand it up. We don't have that. So my concluding thought is we need to use this crisis to really think about what are the new technologies that we want to get underway. Because I said up front in the preparation, I want to speak about hope. Imagine how much less hope we would have today if we didn't have wind, solar, or batteries. And imagine how much more hope we would have for the future if we had green hydrogen, if we had sustainable fuels, if we had storage capabilities, if we had carbon capture. So we need to get serious about this, because you can't live in a world where we all think we're on a highway to hell. We still need to believe the future is better than the past, because otherwise, this is going to be a very dangerous and serious future that we are looking forward to. We can't have that. We need to have some hope, and these technologies can give us hope. Thank you.
Great. Jason, can you address her question, please, and then maybe give us some concluding thoughts?
Sure. And I'll maybe come to it just by agreeing with Catherine that we have known for a long time. We need to act and know how do we do it quickly and how do we implement. And the Inflation Reduction Act is a good example of that, this historic investment of $400 billion. You started by saying the World Energy Outlook projects for the first time ever in its outlook a peak in fossil fuel use, not a big decline, but at least a peak. And they assume things like the implementation of that bill, that we can put that money to work and double in their estimate by 2030 the amount of renewable capacity and increase transmission accordingly. To get to net zero, you're talking about tripling transmission in the US. It took 140 years to build the grid we have now. We have to do it again in 14 and then again 14 after that. You're at the Nature Conservancy. I'm proud to be a trustee in the Nature Conservancy in New York. We spend a lot of time advancing climate action, but thinking about other impacts. If you're going to build an offshore wind farm, it's going to impact fisheries maybe, or you'll have a cable coming on shore through a wetland. And it is hard to permit and build these projects, and it's going to be difficult and challenging, and that's why we are going to need all tools in the toolkit, including, I think, nuclear power. I think what Bill Gates is doing at Breakthrough to help advance nuclear energy, I'm excited by the improvements in technology, broad recognition that it does need to be part of the toolkit for net zero, and there's also a national security argument now to the topic of our panel. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, half the world's nuclear plants were being built by Russia. I think that is a concern from a national security standpoint, and we need to diversify that a bit more. So I would just conclude by saying, I do believe that while there may be bumps in the road and some more coal and diesel here and there just because we have lost Russian gas, in the long term, we will look back and we will kick ourselves if we look back and we think we missed an opportunity, as Anne said, to recognize that many of the things that give you more energy security also move you in a lower carbon direction. That's not just Europe and Russia. That we just had this big spat between the United States and Saudi Arabia over OPEC. Because of the shale revolution, on a net basis, the U.S. doesn't import any oil on a net basis anymore at all. And yet what happens halfway around the world in Vienna or where the oil supply still matters, the thing that makes you more secure is to use less oil and gas and coal in the first place and be less exposed to geopolitical risk. And obviously that's what we need to do to accelerate the clean energy transition.
Great. Jason, you summed it up beautifully. And the note that you struck at the end, I think reminds me of Churchill's words. I'll invoke him again in closing, as I did in opening. He argued that energy security comes from variety and variety alone, by which he meant, of course, energy security arises from diversity. Diversity of geographical supplies, but also, I would argue, in this day and age, of sources of energy. Which gets to the question that was raised from the floor, and that connects to the opportunity, which is the theme of our panel today. I hope you'll agree that our speakers have given us an awful lot to think about. They've provoked us, maybe angered us, but I also feel they have enlightened us. So please give them a nice round of applause to thank them for their insights and their time. You will find this session up on the website of the Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. We hope you enjoy the rest of your COP. Thank you.